Well, we are with Bob Guild, old friend and lawyer extraordinaire who has served the movement for way longer than he probably should have. But we're here to talk about GROW, the grassroots organizing workshop, as well as the anti-war work that he did before that. So thanks for making time, Bob. I really appreciate it. So let's just put you in time and place. Where did you grow up and go to school?
Well, so I bounced all over the country in a military family, like Brett in a lot of ways. My father was a Air Force pilot, and so I never stayed in one place for more than 2 years, and ended up in places from California, Ohio, Colorado, and my father had grown up in Massachusetts. So I ended up going to high school in Massachusetts, and when he retired.
So
Bob's mother was a liberal.
Yeah, I was just going to ask where you get your politics. Was that something that your family, was that part of your family's growing up? Were they liberal, conservative, apolitical? Where did they fall?
Well, it's interesting. My parents, when they voted Republican, and my dad, took this very odd point of view that as a military guy, he really shouldn't be involved in politics. And I think it probably was the case that he didn't vote for a long time because he just felt like, sort of exercising political neutrality was part of the mission of, being a professional soldier or airman in his case. And but I don't recall him having strong, or my mom having strong political opinions at all. And ironically, during the Vietnam era, my dad, said that, much to my surprise, that he agreed with my anti-war views, and literally said, had he been in my shoes, he thought he would, be a war protester as well, which is pretty astounding to think about. But yeah, I think one of the things about growing up in a military family to me was that the mystique of sort of authoritarianism was never attractive. And I always kind of saw through these crusty old military guys as really having just this sort of hardcore facade. I can't tell you how many retired Army colonels or military colonels and that level I've dealt with over my years, and they have that military bearing and authoritarian facade, but they're pussycats underneath, and you just got to know that to deal with them, really.
Yeah. So how and when did you get to Columbia?
Well, Brett and I were comparing notes, and I had been a conscientious objector and had been participating in DC anti-war activities, and going to these big marches and organizing on campus, and doing teach-ins and campus strikes against the war. And I was in the Army Reserves and was on the verge of being commissioned as a second lieutenant when I made the decision to become a conscientious objector. And so I got discharged from the Army as a CO and thrown into the draft. And it was at that point when my case was sort of in court challenging a denial of CO status by my draft board that I came to South Carolina to do anti-war organizing with GIs and draft counseling, with draft eligible guys like me. I had been counseled and trained by the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, and they were doing lots of conscientious objector work dating back to the First World War, really, out of their Quaker nonviolent perspective. And so with a lot of training from them, I came south to work with GIs at Fort Jackson. And as Brett and I were talking, I came to South Carolina, came to Columbia just after the UFO coffee house, the GI coffee house on Main Street, had been shut down by the authorities, and the GI rights organizers who ran that coffee house had been prosecuted and essentially run out of South Carolina. So I came here to work with them and found that they had been routed from the scene. And so I inherited, their logistical structure, and friends of mine and I organized a replacement GI rights organization in Columbia.
The place on Lee Street?
Yeah, and we moved into a place that got known as the zoo in the community because we had such a collection of misfits that hung out there. Us included, of course, but we had lots of GIs that crashed there at night, and the place was always a constant coming and going. We used to hear stories about the investigators, the criminal investigation division at Fort Jackson, pulling up outside and photographing license tags so that GIs who dared to stop by to socialize or get GI rights counseling would be put on the list, right? And anyhow, yes, we stayed at the zoo. A couple of years after that, moved to Charleston and organized a similar project to work with sailors at the Navy base. The Navy base in North Charleston was an active base at the time, and they were sending World War II era destroyers to Vietnam from Charleston. And we organized crew members who objected to the war and sought to exercise their rights to speak and to resist. Published an underground newspaper in Columbia and in Charleston that was distributed on base to service people, and had a really vigorous organizing program in both Columbia and in
let me interrupt and take you back to Massachusetts when you applied for CO. That was clearly easier to do in Massachusetts than it was in South Carolina. But what was your argument to be a conscientious objector?
Well, it was a non-sectarian, non-religious moral objection to the war in Vietnam, and that was sort of the harder needle to thread. I turned out to be the first CO applicant in my draft board in Massachusetts, which was a pretty conservative community. So despite the assumption that somehow it would be well received, no, it was denied unanimously. And that's why I was in litigation challenging that decision. But Brett, what I learned very, very quickly is, I was white, middle-class guy, college graduate. I could write an essay. And so threading the needle of, applying for a CO exemption, a conscientious objector status that allowed me to avoid, killing innocent people in Vietnam or being shot at myself, easy enough for me. But, the rich man's war, poor man's fight was certainly the rule in Vietnam. And so the people doing the fighting and dying on the American side, were largely working class rural people and people of color. And what I learned was, it was far more common among those guys to object to the war, but far less common for them to have the, privilege to be able to write the CO application essay. And that's why GI rights counseling became such an important, mission for my friends and I who were doing this work.
So you said that you were doing campus organizing. What campus was that?
Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. So, we were about an hour and a half from DC. And so I spent a lot of time traveling back and forth to DC. I wound up staying in the basement of a U.S. Senator, Charles Goodell. You might remember he was a conservative congressman from Western New York who took Bobby Kennedy's Senate seat and became a leader in trying to fight the funding for the Vietnam War. So Charles Goodell surprised lots of people by essentially becoming a strident anti-war opponent in the U.S. Senate, and so I volunteered in his office for a couple of months and stayed in his basement. I remember running into Strom Thurmond. The first time I ever met Strom Thurmond was in an elevator in the U.S. Capitol building, and I was wearing a suit, had long hair and a beard, but I had a big button on with a peace dove and a red fist over it, with an anti-war slogan. And I can remember getting on this elevator that I was, sent on some minion job to go get airplane tickets for the senator and his staff. I get on the elevator and there's Senator Thurmond, and he looks at me and looks at that button and just starts squawking. And I mean, it's this unintelligible sort of like rant. And I can remember the elevator gets to a floor and I'm just standing there like, dumbstruck, recognized him, of course. And elevator gets to his floor and his aides say, Senator, this is your floor. We got to catch a plane. We got to catch a plane. And the senator just, Strom paid no attention to him. And they finally, one guy on either side had to literally lift him up by the elbows and walk him out of the elevator. And I thought, wow, that was really something. Little did I know that
he was only like 80. He was only like 80 then, right?
I mean, I know exactly. You thought, well, it was only downhill from there. But, it was an astounding experience. It's old Strom,
Welcome to South Carolina, boy.
I know exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I wound up, years later, working on chairing a committee for the city of Columbia, literally sitting next to Strom Thurmond at a banquet, having Floyd Spence, Republican congressman on one side, and Strom Thurmond on the other, and Strom and I having small talk. It was.
Were you involved in Students for Democratic Society in college?
No. It was the mobilization, and it was sort of broad-based, alliance of all these anti-war groups, and I just really can't remember what national affiliations we had beyond that, but let's face it, the anti-war movement was extremely broad-based at that stage. There were hundreds of thousands of people showing up in the streets in DC routinely.
Were you at the protest in DC after, I guess it was after Nixon was elected, not even before, when Country Joe sang the fish rag on the mall, and there was like 1 million people doing F?
Yeah, and I worked real closely with Vietnam vets against the war later, and I can remember going to the Republican National Convention in Miami Beach in 1972, and marching in the streets with Vietnam vets. The 82nd Airborne had been mobilized by Nixon, and they were just outside. Just south of Miami. We leafleted, we snuck into the base and leafleted GIs who were very receptive. I tell you what now, most GIs that I knew at the time, they had Jimi Hendrix posters on the wall, they smoked dope, they grew their hair as long as they could get away with. And, sticking it to the man and resisting authority was just, the norm amongst most of the enlisted guys that I knew, and of course we know how much resistance there was amongst GIs in Vietnam themselves that largely, ground the American war effort to a halt. So I think we underestimate the role inside the American military of resistance to that war. But I knew it was true among Vietnam vets who were in the streets in Miami Beach. And, we were tear gassed. I got maced a couple of times at the convention center. There were, lots and lots of very, very chilling activist events in the streets. And I can remember literally hitchhiking back to Columbia and starting law school the day after I hitchhiked back from the Republican National Convention in the streets of Miami Beach, and literally thought I was doing a good job. I changed into blue jeans and a t-shirt, and I wound up finding that I was one of 2 or 3 people in my entering class in law school that weren't wearing suits and ties. So, well, this is going to be an interesting experience.
What prompted you to stay in South Carolina? Was it the admission to the law school?
Well, I decided, I've been doing all this GI rights work, and I'd go out to Fort Jackson and visit guys in the stockade who were war resistors. I remember a guy, who's literally refused to wear the uniform, even a uniform without insignia. And he was literally in his underwear naked in a cell at the stockade. And, I would visit and counsel him. And I remember meeting JAG officers and, Judge Advocate General Corps officers who were military lawyers. And they were less familiar than I was with the intricacies of Army regs and, Uniform Code of Military Justice as it related to free speech and free expression activities, GI rights. And I can remember literally, coaching JAG lawyers on this stuff. And I think largely for those kinds of experiences, I decided that what I wanted to do was get, a South Carolina-based legal education and stay and work in this community. If you're rootless like I was at that point, where you literally had lived everywhere, but nowhere in particular. I have to say it also, I was at the stage of my life where I was looking to nest someplace and adopt a community, and Columbia was and is it.
Bob, you say you got here when the UFO was closing, so that was after the GIs united against the war stuff at Fort Jackson, except, the trial was probably still going on about the Fort Jackson 8. Did you meet any of those guys that were involved with that? Because the trial went on for like 7 years. And
no, later
I'm wrong. That was a different case, but it went on for a while. And so I just wondered what kind of legacy did they leave, and did that group survive longer than, was that still active when you were there?
No, I don't think it was at all. I later met, the ACLU lawyers that represented Howard Levy, who was the military doctor who refused to train Green Berets as a matter of conscience, and was prosecuted and convicted, by the way. But
yeah, that's the case that went for 7 years.
Yeah, and so I met Lachlan McDonald, who was a South Carolina guy from Winsboro, South Carolina, Fairfield County. And Lachlan, for many years, ran the ACLU's regional office in Atlanta, where he principally did voting rights work, just enormously impactful lawyering on behalf of particularly African-American communities around voting rights issues, Native American communities out west too, but litigated in front of the Supreme Court and achieved victories for disenfranchised communities who got a seat at the table. I can remember opening up county councils and school boards in places like Abbeville County and Lawrence County with ACLU work that Lachlan was doing. But he represented Howard Levy and GI rights folks there, and a number of other anti-war and conscientious objectors, anti-war organizers and conscientious objectors. But no, when I got here, literally the support structure in the Columbia community for GI rights had been decimated. The defendants the organizers of the UFO coffee house who had the GI rights project, they were prosecuted by the solicitor John Ford, who Brett remembers fondly, I know, for creating a public nuisance. And the allegation was that they distributed pornography in the sense of cartoons in an underground newspaper, and that they condoned the distribution of illegal drugs, which people were probably smoking pot out front, and none of that stuff was true or was a legitimate basis for the public nuisance action shutting down the coffee house. It was obvious that they were troubled by the messaging and the First Amendment free speech activities going on there. So when I got to Columbia, the organizers of the UFO had been convicted, and they had appealed their conviction. I think the ACLU probably represented them as well. And as a condition of their bond, in other words, to avoid having to start serving a sentence, they were told they had to show up at the state Supreme Court every day and sit in the audience, waiting for their case to be called, and their case wasn't going to be called for months and months and months. So it was a sort of it was sort of like being held hostage, and it really was. And ultimately, they and their lawyers negotiated an agreement where they had the charges dropped on the condition that they leave the state and never return. And so they did. They left South Carolina, and literally that was how, you know, the authorities in Columbia, you know, removed the scourge of, you know, the GI rights organizing that was going on at the coffee house. But when I got here, you know, what since became the elite Epicurean restaurant and has been through a number of other permutations, you know, it had James Baldwin quotes in the lettering around the, you know, the storefront window, and still had the sign out front. And of course it was shuttered, but you know, the facility was there for all to see, shall we say.
Now,
And
Bob,
we
was
adhered.
that 1970? Was that your first year at
Yeah,
Carolina?
1970, right? Sure.
1970.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I was still there.
Yeah.
I mean, you were aware there was activity on the campus when you were.
Well, you know, I wasn't really tuned into the campus stuff at all, Brett, and I wasn't because, you know, I had started school, and you know, I was working the streets with GI rights work. And you know, one of the ironies there was Columbia always like presented itself as this military friendly town.
Mhm.
And they were friendly to the brass, and they were friendly to the defense contractors. But you could not have found a more hostile community environment, at least from the Chamber of Commerce perspective, toward rank and file GIs. And, you know, GIs who were going through basic training, you know, we're now the largest basic training facility in the country, and we were one of the largest at the time of the Vietnam War. They'd be turned loose for you know, a night on the town, and GIs would be hustled on Main Street by jewelry salesmen who'd say, you know, we'll give you a loan for a diamond ring for your girlfriend since you might not come back from Vietnam. Literally, they're like, you know, hustling these guys as they're getting ready to board, you know, planes to go off to war, and taking their money. At the same token, clubs around the university wouldn't serve GIs. I mean, guy shows up with a short haircut, you know, the buzz cut of a basic trainee, and they'd say, "Let me see your college ID." I said, "Well, I'm not in college. I'm at the fort." And they go, "Well, sorry, we don't. You know, you have to be you have to be a student or something like that." So literally, GIs were not welcome. They were not, and it was a very unwelcoming scene on Main Street. You know, you'd see religious proselytizers who wanted to save their lives before they shipped out, and jewelry salesmen. And other than that, you know, there were a handful of anti-war activists who made a point of, you know, of welcoming GIs and listening to their stories, and if they could, helping them to see that their resistance to the war would get support in the community.
Let me put a footnote in here, because I don't know if Becci knows this, that at the time we're talking about now, Fort Jackson being like the largest training base, the people that I was dealing with that were the GIs were active duty. The people that would be bussed in, literally, lots and lots at a time, were the trainees, and they would flood the town. And see, they didn't have civilian clothes. And the people that we were working with in short times and that type of stuff, they were active duty, so they didn't even have to live on the base. They had civilian clothes, they had maybe a car. But these poor trainees, man, they were like young and very, very young and pretty well scared.
Well, that's true. And, you know, I had a colleague, friend, who was as you say, you know, a permanent party. He worked at the fort, and he'd been a West Point cadet, and he ran the radio station, and he got expelled from West Point for smoking pot. And so his sentence was, you know, you got to serve the rest of your 4-year enlistment as an E1, you know, a grunt on active duty. And so he went to Fort Jackson. He was the most resistant and uncooperative GI you could imagine. He wore his hair in a blondish afro that was kind of like minimally regulation, and he shaved a peace sign on top of his head. and he drove a VW bus that was painted red, white, and blue stripes with a peace sign, you know, where the VW thing is in the front. And he'd go back and forth to Fort Jackson every day, and he lived in our basement on Lee Street. And you know, he just was as he was thumbing his nose at the man every day, and they tolerated him because, you know, they had to, but he was going to come as close to the line as he possibly could. And at the same time, he supported the Short Times, which was the underground paper that we continued at the fort, and distributed it, and you know, would talk up anti-war activities to anybody who'd listen. Yeah, so there was a real difference, as you say, Brett, between the guys who came in for their you know, their basic training and then shipped out, and the guys who were permanent party.
Bob, the Short Times that you're talking about, that was a really revolutionary and one of the longest running of those kind of underground GI papers. And I was so happy to find it. And there's like this repository in Wisconsin. I'll send you a link
Really? No kidding.
of all kind of underground papers. And they think the full issues of the Short Times. And they're so, I mean, it's really remarkable that they were allowed to be, that they were churning that stuff out and for 6 years. And that's quite something to do, you know, and it started out really primitive, as you probably know, and then it became pretty sophisticated with, like, you know, a distribution base and all of that. But it was so, just so badass, I thought, for them to, and all those soldiers that were there. I mean, the UFO was great, but those guys were doing some pretty risky stuff and paying the price for it at Fort Jackson. And the first shots of the GI anti-war movement were from Fort Jackson. I didn't know that until just recently, and I think that's underappreciated. So thank you for this conversation.
Sure. Well, you know, you guys have put out a paper for a long time, and I learned just how raggedy ass it could be doing that. It was not sophisticated. But I remember laying it out, you know, wherever the hard way was, and going down to R.L. Bryan to get the plates made, or whatever you call those things at the time. And then we would take them we would drive to North Carolina. There was whatever that kind of press was that did the tabloid stuff. There was a little underground press in a barn in, I think it was Mebane, North Carolina, off I-85. And we drive up there, you know, make it a 2-day run of it. And they would print, you know, the newspaper. We'd fill up the back of another friend's VW bus with bundles of Short Times newspapers and bring them back. And then the next day we would take them out to the fort, and we'd sneak them into the barracks and distribute them. And I got busted once out there and banned from the fort. You know, the MPs found us, or somebody ratted us out, and you know, they wrote you up and said, you know, here's your official notice, you're formally banned from returning to the fort.
You were found inimical to the conduct and morale of the troops of the general's charge.
Something like that. But those papers were very popular, and they circulated everywhere. You know, as we all know, you tell people they can't read something, and it's going to, you know, rise to the top of the bestseller list. And of course, it's a free paper, and people just ate it up because it you know, expressed solidarity with what they were going through, provided information, because there was always, you know, really meaty information, and then lots of editorial content that, you know, was stimulating and provided a point of view that they weren't going to get through, you know, official channels, about their rights, and, you know, about a resistance within the military to the war. So in any event, it was a very, very interesting time, and then we did a lot to replicate that experience in Charleston, with particularly the Navy base, but the Navy and the Air Base too. You know, the Charleston Air Base was, like it has been for wars since then, you know, a logistical hub with those large transport planes. You know, the C-5A back in the day when we were doing this in the 1970, 71. You know, C-17s now, big, you know, heavy planes that can land on remote airfields, delivering war material, and they did that in Vietnam. And then in the Navy, they, at the end of the war, toward the end of the war, they used these old battleships from World War II literally sit offshore and use the big guns to shell, near the demilitarized zone. So they sort of, wielded death from 20 miles away offshore on these Charleston-based destroyers. And we work with Navy crew members who resisted going. Yeah. Brett, you're
Brett, unmute. Brett.
Yes.
Jeez.
Are the birds bothering y'all? You hear the cheeping?
I love the birds. No,
Okay, well, kill the bird. Then I won't mute. But I wanted to move through the 70s and get you to recollect anything that was happening when the university, after Kent State, when the university kind of blew up.
Yeah, well, that was all before my time, or when I wasn't around. I mean,
May 70. Okay,
yeah,
you came in fall 70.
Yeah, I came in after that, Brett. And, so I saw not only the aftermath of the UFO, but, all the folks who had occupied the administration building and been busted. I mean, I can remember vivid conversations with folks like Becci Hardy years later about, her experience with, the agent provocateur's role and your own, of course, Brett, with just how hard the authorities went to try to subvert, activism. And I mean, it's just astounding when you think about the level of resources and effort directed at you and, your associates at that time to try to neutralize, the points of resistance as they saw it. And, you paid a price, and a lot of other folks did too. But the reality is, you can't keep that sort of effort down. And in many ways, the counterattack just spurs more resistance. I remember meeting guys when I was here doing GI counseling who were seeking conscientious objector status from the National Guard. And they told me stories about how their leadership wanted, Guard units from like West Columbia and Lexington County were being mobilized to go on campus to put down student activism. And, the sort of authorities' prevailing attitude, let's go kick some hippies in the ass, let's go beat some hippie skulls. And, there were guys in the Guard who opposed the war and supported anti-war activities and really chafed and resented the notion that they were being used as sort of gun thugs of, the establishment to put down legitimate protest. And I mean, I remember meeting guys who literally said that to me and, wanted to resist the direction to be used as sort of riot control thugs by the authorities.
Were you able to get anybody in South Carolina signed up as a CO?
Oh,
How
sure.
hard was it? Speak to that.
Sure.
How hard was it to be a CO in South Carolina?
Well, it was hard. I mean, a lot of folks, objected in various ways. And as I said, if you had the luck of either the privilege of a middle class education and could take care of your own interests, write a good essay, you could do that and did do that. If you happen to be one of the handful of folks who were able to find their way to our doorstep, a GI Rights Project, we could counsel you and support you and assist you in filing a claim. But there are lots of folks who just never got either of those advantages. And I remember, I think it was Lachlan, but one of the ACLU lawyers represented a conscientious objector in federal court. And this happened not infrequently in South Carolina, but lots of other places too, where ultimately, if you lost all of your draft appeals through the selective service system, your recourse was to sue in federal court and try to get a federal court to recognize your CO status. And there was a judge named Robert Hemphill, long since passed away, who was extremely conservative, former South Carolina solicitor and congressman, real reactionary from Chester County. And I remember hearing the story where the ACLU lawyers representing a conscientious objector claimant in federal court, and Judge Hemphill was reputed to have said when the case was called, "Bring the coward forward." Now that inspires a lot of confidence in, judicial objectivity and independence, and respect for the Constitution, doesn't it? So, yeah, it was a hostile place to be a CEO, for sure. Yeah.
Did you have any dealings with Charles Morgan when he was working with the law?
No, I knew of him, but and I think Lachlan worked for Charles. It seems to me Charles was in the Atlanta office before Lachlan became the regional director, in which capacity he served for many years. But it wasn't Charles was a good bit older, as I recall.
I wouldn't say a good bit, probably maybe as many as 10 years, 8 years. Which,
okay, yeah. No, I never met him, but of course he was also in the Howard Levy defense, right? Didn't he lead the Howard Levy defense?
Yes, he did.
Yeah. Julian Bond, Muhammad Ali, he was pretty big time.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, it's I mean, in terms of anti-war activism, I mean, we all know that speaking out against a war that's the establishment's mission, it can be really difficult. I mean, Eugene Debs sat in jail running for president, right? Because they prosecuted him for, violating, laws against sedition that are so obviously unconstitutional.
You put your finger on something that I want to dwell on a little bit and get your opinions, because I got one. What did America and the establishment learn from the massive protests from Vietnam to today? We have wars going on all over the place. Nobody's in the streets. What's different now?
Well, that's a good question, Brett.
That's why I asked it.
No. I mean, to my one way of looking at it that I think is pertinent is, the draft was a great equalizer in the sense that, your fates ultimately were determined largely by the lottery, by a luck of the draw. I mean, how ominous, or put it this way, how ancient a phenomenon is it having your fates determined by the flip of a coin, or the number that you pull out of a bin or something. But aside from that, the draft, despite all of the efforts at trying to stack the deck in favor of privilege, and let's face it, it was CO's one vehicle for privilege to be exercised. But a lot of privileged folks went into the National Guard because they assumed the Guard was a way of avoiding war. And think of George W. Bush. He's partying and missing action, missing meetings while he's serving in the Texas Air National Guard, and pays virtually no price for it. But that's a privilege, and that's a way out. But aside from those vehicles, which were available for sure to privileged people, the war was a democratic institution in the sense that the draft swept a far wider swath of American populace than does the military now. When we created the so-called volunteer professional military, we eliminated the reach of the draft or conscription from reaching into the middle class, reaching into college campuses, and it made it that much more difficult, frankly, for Americans to see the price of our foreign warfare, since it didn't affect nearly as wide a swath of American people. So I think that's a big deal. And we all oppose the draft. We thought the draft's a terrible thing. But in some ways, think about it, the draft was a great equalizer, and it ensured that that wars had to be more popular than they are now. Didn't it? I mean, that's what I think.
There's some black congressman, I think, that has recently been disgraced, kept introducing every year, bring the draft back, and I agreed with him. It's an equalizer, and it would make America more careful about going to war.
I think so too. And we learned from the fact that, I mean, if you don't want to say that the volunteer military or mercenaries, because let's face it, you're not paid very much to be in the Army or other services. But the reality is, it still largely targets rural and working class communities, because people need a job, and the job of last resort is oftentimes joining the military. I mean, how many times we hear people who the judge says to you, you can either go to jail or join the Army, and that's kind of like it's a sentence, an alternative sentence. Well, okay, I'll join the Army. Anyway, point is, it is a great equalizer, and in some ways, it's made it that much easier for us to engage in foreign adventures with less political cost. And that's a shame. It really is a shame.
Let's get you through law school.
Yeah.
And speak to some of the people that were in your class. This is 1970.
Well, if you want to talk about the connection to GI rights, the other guy that both of us know who came to Columbia to work on GI rights issues was David Bruck. And David, who was a Canadian, had been doing GI rights organizing at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, which was, and it wasn't a basic training base. I remember it was a base where they did advanced training for, I think, armor, but I'm not sure. Tanks,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah. And so anyway, I don't think they had a coffee house, but they had a GI rights project. And so David came to Columbia literally to go to USC Law School to do work with GIs at Fort Jackson. And I've got a sign next door. You put the sign case. I got a sign next door that Rick Beatty painted for me, and it says GI Rights Project on it. And we had it hanging. If you know where the Parthenon restaurant was in 5 Points on Hardin Street, we had an office upstairs that was our GI Rights Counseling Center, and we had a sign on the front of the building that said GI Rights Project. And David and I would take David Bruck and I would take phone messages while we were in law school, recordings from Fort Jackson GIs who were looking to get advice about conscientious objection or free speech activities and GI rights in general. So we were doing that kind of work in school for sure.
And Lewis Pitts?
Lewis was ahead of me. Lewis was, I guess he's older, but Lewis was a class or so ahead of me.
He's all right.
And as was Bob Warren, but I was, I was in school. It turns out, interestingly enough to me, that while I described my first day or so there as, being in a hostile work environment, everybody with suits and ties on, that sort of thing. A third of our class, our law school was the first class in the new building on that ugly monstrosity. It looks like the Metropolitan Correctional Center on Assembly Street. They increased the size of our law school tremendously, including the faculty and the student body. And the consequence was that they brought in a lot of students from out of state. And it had a tremendously liberalizing effect on both the faculty and the student body. So about a third of the students in my class were veterans, had gotten out of the military. And I love these guys. I mean, these guys, they'd seen the world. They knew the underbelly of American, democracy, so-called, and didn't have any illusions at all. I mean, they weren't going to be treated as, plantation, the sons of planters, which is what the tradition was at USC Law School. They were the sons of,
the Murdoch.
Yeah, the sons of senators and the sons of solicitors, the sons of the movers and shakers. So these guys, had no illusions about any of that stuff, and had seen the world and had been in the military, and were generally much more liberal than a lot of their other classmates. And the same thing could be said about faculty. I mean, I had a professor who taught employment discrimination, and another professor who taught labor law. The labor law professor had been a teacher in Milwaukee, where he'd represented labor unions. Now, can you imagine that? Imagine having a labor law teacher who represented unions teaching law labor law in South Carolina. Well, he lasted, a couple of years. And shortly after I graduated, they ran him off, or he, ran himself off. I'm not sure which, but the point is, it was a liberalizing experience in many ways. And I had a lot of colleagues in law school who went on to do, I think, really great things. I mean, David, of course, made a career out of fighting the death penalty in some of the most difficult and unpopular cases imaginable. And a number of other colleagues worked as public defenders, representing poor people in criminal cases. And, a number of folks, had really important work, advocating for civil liberties and representing, people who need representation. So I found it a real interesting experience, much to my surprise, because to tell you the truth, I was expecting to sort of keep a low profile in law school for 3 years and get my ticket and be able to, be an activist lawyer without having to suffer too much of the pain of the indoctrination process at the law school.
When you, let's get to the point where there were GROW meetings in your house. When did you meet Fran? When did you meet me?
Well, I met your ex before I met you. And, literally I was living in one of these mill houses where I am now. It was probably not this one. I rented a couple different mill houses over time in the first couple of years I was in.
It was next door to the one you're in now, I recall.
What's that now?
I think it was next door to the one you bought. Anyway, that was.
Well, yes, that's right. Exactly so. So your ex Fran and I, she was living in the bread truck, the step van that you guys had, and was sort of camping out in people's backyards. And the house next to me was derelict, and it's since been fixed up for student housing, and is immaculate on the outside, and got countertop, granite countertops on the inside, et cetera. But at the time, it had no windows, and the floor was rotted out in the kitchen from the roof leaking. And the owners lived someplace else, on the other side of town, and they were working people, couldn't afford to fix the house up. And so they told me I could live in the house rent free if I worked on fixing it up. And I put windows in it and put plywood down where the kitchen floor, the holes were in the kitchen floor. But your ex Fran and I shared that house for a while, and I remember we cooked on a Coleman stove in the kitchen, and did our best to keep the cold air out during the winter time, and what was left of the window frames and stuff. I met Fran, and shortly after that, Brett, in addition to doing the GI rights work that really did continue during law school, a number of colleagues and I in law school were doing prisoners' rights work at CCI, at the Central Correctional Institution. And I think I met you when you were being transferred to CCI, because I had been working with a number of former Black Panthers, or not former, but active Black Panthers who were in prison at CCI and doing prisoners' rights work inside the institution. And we were representing them or advocating or meeting with them. And I mean, I can remember Leonard Hamilton.
Leonard Hamilton. I was just getting ready to mention his name.
Yeah. David Saxner.
Mm-hmm.
So David was a white guy, activist, of course, too, but he had been one of the first big pot busts on the coast, and they sent him to do time at CCI, like he was a danger to society. Yeah. Leonard Hamilton was serving life at the time, later exonerated, I recall. But basically the two of them, black-white combo, guy from the streets of Philly, and I don't remember where David was, from Chicago, I think. Oh. They teamed up to do a prisoners' rights, a prisoners' union at
Self-Improvement Coalition. I think.
That's right, Self-Improvement Coalition, because they were basically, they were doing forced labor in the tag plant, making license tags and street signs for the highway department, and being paid 5 cents an hour, whatever the pay was at the time. And so anyway, they were organizing behind the wall, and the Department of Corrections tolerated it for a time, and then put their foot down when they started having news conferences. But I recall you I'm meeting you on your early days at CCI when you'd been transferred there. And of course,
Was
they would
Chris
send you there
Coates?
with no good intentions, right?
No. Did you meet Chris Coates then?
Chris Coates?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. But I'm trying to think when I met Chris. You know, that's a good question. But yeah.
Well, he was involved with, I think he was still in law school, but he got out and he was working with the ACLU. But
That's right.
we'll come back to Chris after this
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it was years later. I mean, it's not even in the Grow book when he went bad.
Oh,
And that's
oh,
another
yeah.
story for you. But
Yeah.
I remember distinctly that the Grow started as a migratory, weekly meeting, monthly meeting, and that we were in your house at some point before we got the building, the Grow building.
Well,
Did I
that's
make that
true.
up?
I guess that's right. We were doing, you know, sort of what do we call them? Book clubs, reading circles, reading radical literature, and having discussions. So it was great. It was a great time. I really enjoyed it. Monopoly Capital, I remember reading. Whatever that was.
Baron and Swayze.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Yep,
And books
yep,
about organizing, and it was really an exciting time to do that. You know, of course, I met Nancy through Grow too. You may remember that or not, but you know, I remember Nancy came to Columbia to run the domestic violence program at Sister Care, which she stayed for many years. You know, she met a number of the social worker friends, and one of her friends, she said to one of her friends, well, I don't really, you know people who, I haven't met anybody who, you know, uses swear words or you know, talks trash, and I'm looking for some alternative, some rowdy folks, you know, and her friend said, well, you know, you ought to meet these friends of mine at Grow. And she came to a meeting at Grow, and I said, well, I want to meet this woman now, and I remember afterwards chatting her up on the outside, and she said, I said, well, you know, let's get together sometime, and she said something like, well, I'm in the book, you know, like, okay, well, I guess that's not very receptive, and she thought she was being flirtatious by saying that, you know. Anyway, I met Nancy through Grow. It was fun. Yeah.
Well, we're at the Grow point, which is what I'm going to remind you. This is the Grow book, and so Becci,
yeah, there you go.
ask Bob. She needs to outline some questions she wants answered, so we don't talk all time. Becci.
Okay.
No, I want to respect your time, and like you said, we haven't even gotten to Grow yet. But this really valuable stuff. But I just wondered, if you had to describe Grow to somebody who'd never been there, and I guess it had different, you know, it evolved over time, but in the early days, if you were to show up at Grow, what did it look like and feel like?
Well, you know, you talked about the book, you know, circles or the reading circles or whatever we want to call them at the time, but you know, that was just extraordinarily stimulating, and it focused really on a small group of people who, you know, invested time in trying to figure out how to change the world. I mean, you know, we were trying to not just academically understand, you know, these radical visions of the world, but how to implement, you know, these ways of thinking and analytical processes into, you know, activism. And so it was very much always that, you know, focused on action and activism. But I must say, I appreciated the social elements as well. You know, I managed to say Grow was, you know, was a 10-minute walk from my house to the cafe, to Old Bluff Road and the building. And you know, it was a really welcoming social place to be with like-minded folks. And I always thought, you know, that one of the, you know, key missing pieces in my life, aside from Grow, was the idea of a neighborhood bar, you know, to be clear about it, the place where you literally could meet friends and know that you were in a welcoming and sympathetic community. And, you know, you can do that on a variety of levels. You can do it on a level like you know, we like baseball or hunting fish together, that sort of thing. But for me, the important thing was being with like-minded people who, you know, had an orientation toward activism and changing the world and organizing. And so the idea of meeting folks who are all linked by that experience and that commitment was just the key to me. And the cafe was a wonderful place to be with like-minded folks. And so I really appreciated that. And of course, how many campaigns were involved. I mean, the one we're going to start talking about, or that you asked me to talk about for this call was, the fight about the sign at the State House. But that was just, one of hundreds of, episodes of activism that, that was centered on GROW and that group and that place, that institution. So, yeah, I mean, it was, important, really important to me, that's for sure, and missed in that regard. I mean, I missed the social element of the cafe as a gathering place. Sure.
Well, back to that Campbell case, what stands out in your mind? What do you remember about that? I mean, other than it was a really rare and beautiful victory, which.
Yeah, and rare is right. I mean, you guys frame it as, a rare victory, but, from a lawyering perspective, that's true too. I mean, I can't tell you how many righteous causes that did not lead to victory. I mean, we have a judicial system and a constitutional legal system that, evinces principles that are oftentimes not lived up to. I mean, you get lots of hostile judges who I don't care what the law says or what the Constitution says, I'm not going to rule for you, and you can take me to court, you can appeal me. There's a roadmap to Richmond, as the federal judges in South Carolina used to say. We're talking about the appeals court when they just were not going to do the right thing and they didn't care. Take me up on appeal. But the sign case was a really interesting and unique experience for me, and also a reflection, I think, of the importance, of course, of being able to defend the right of free expression, the right to free speech, the ability to organize and challenge authority. So, and it's also, frankly, a testament, Brett, to your charm and savoir-faire. And here's how I think that worked out. You, as I remember, you told me and Bob Hallman, the other lawyer that worked on the case, you told us that, you carried your permit application or your paperwork into the Budget and Control Board office, and a clerk, administrative assistant sitting there, was responsible for processing these applications. And you fully expected her to say no. I mean, to say, no, we don't allow no rowdy anti-war messaging on our State House grounds. And, you'd have to deal with the fact how unfair and perhaps illegal that would have been to do that. And as I remember you telling me the story, she said, well, when do you want to do it? And they had a book, and the book had a calendar in it. And all you had to do was basically tell them when you wanted to do it, when there weren't conflicting claims on that particular spot. And mostly those claims, as I recall at the time, as you described, it was the United Way would have their fundraiser, the Chamber of Commerce, sort of establishment fundraiser, would have the big thermometer vertical signs sitting in front of the State House facing Main Street. And, they would, the red bar would go up as they came close to meeting their campaign goals, and the sign would stay up for a period of, I don't know, weeks or months until they did it. And then the sign would come down after the campaign was over. And so the question was, is there a space available for the sign? And as I remember you saying, the clerk said, here's a date, put you down for it. And you more or less said, I don't think you know what you're getting in for, to sister. You know what the sign is we're talking about? She says, oh, it doesn't matter. We don't discriminate against the content of signs. It's just a matter of first come, first serve. Basically, she was doing what the Constitution called for her to do. which is to be neutral about content, which is not to discriminate based on a point of view being controversial or something that the authorities don't smile upon. And you got your permit, right? Isn't that the way it worked? That's what I remember you telling me anyhow. And she was willing to say that to her boss when it turned out that that the governor got wind of this before the sign was actually erected, and behind closed doors made it clear, the governor, Carol Campbell, made it clear that he was not going to tolerate Brett Bursey or GROW having a message, an anti-war message on his state house grounds. And he had a very strong personal opinion about you and your experience objecting to the Vietnam War. And he wasn't going to tolerate your message and you being the messenger, and told his minions to, by whatever means necessary, deny the permit. And they conjured up a sham process for appearing to change the rules and use that as a basis for denying revoking your permit. And all of that came out in the wash. It came out in the wash because there were, I will call them bureaucrats, but they were state employees who were honest enough to tell the truth, even when it included implicating the governor in an act that violated the law, violated the Constitution, and caused him to lose in court. Right.
That case expanded on Edwards VSC. And my recollection is that one of perhaps the lingering value of it was you had something to do with this in terms of basically rewriting the utilization of public property, and
Sure.
that you don't need permission to use public property.
Sure.
And that's when they created the reservation process as opposed to permitting.
Well, permitting is still allowed, and still,
As long as
First Amendment, allows you to have conditions on assembly and speech, but you can't do viewpoint discrimination. You can't pick and choose which views you allow to be communicated, and you got to have a rational process that meets certain minimum due process standards, which they did not. And so just two things happened with this case. One is we brought a lawsuit that called for a jury trial, and we had a jury trial. And that jury trial ended before the jury had a chance to reach a verdict. But when the judge had ruled for us, the federal judge had ruled for us on key legal issues that made it clear that the governor and the budget board had liability. In other words, that they had violated the law. And the question really is for the jury was going to be how much to sock it to, what the damages were going to be. And at that point, the defendants settled the case, and we accepted that settlement, the $50,000 settlement, which was just unprecedented in terms of valuing free speech. Typically, your speech would be valued at nominal damage. You get $1 or something. You got $1 and a handshake, pat on the back. Good job. But no, this was a case where they knew that the governor was really wrong, and they offered very, very substantial settlement. Then, secondarily, that same judge later, at our request, issued a declaratory judgment, a court order that specifically invalidated the procedures that had been adopted to permit signs and other activity on the State House grounds. And she directed them to promulgate regulations that met certain constitutional standards for due process. And those basically called for a rational decision-making process that was content neutral and that gave you an opportunity for due process, to basically appeal a bad decision and to get review of what otherwise could just be an arbitrary no. And that's what it was in your case. Carol Campbell basically putting his thumb on the scale and telling his minions to revoke your permit for an improper reason. So we won twice. Basically, we got on the face of a jury likely to award you damages and really embarrass the governor even more. You got a good settlement that I know got you a new printing press, which is great. And we got a declaratory judgment that required them to have a constitutionally compliant and neutral permitting process for use of the state house grounds, which is what they have.
That's the element that lingers that we need to continue to lift up, because I spend 51% of my time in terms of advising people. No, the police can't do that. And there just needs to be continual education to the cops that no, you can't do that.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, it's true. And you know, let's face it, when I started law school in 1972, I thought, gosh, the Supreme Court's terrible, and man, the law is just, you know, not friendly. And you know, what I now realize is that was the high watermark of the respect for the Constitution. You know, prisoners' rights were at a high watermark that have been eroded seriously since then. First Amendment rights, likewise, and of course, you know, we now see reproductive rights and rights to privacy and rights to organize, you know, being restricted, left, right, and center, rights to fair elections, you know, voting rights being eroded left, right, and center by our current Supreme Court. So I only appreciate how good things were in terms of the law having a framework to protect people's rights to democratically organize and to change, to seek change. And those rights, you know, are always at risk, and they've been eroded pretty significantly since then.
That is, I think, really important, and Becci needs to make a star on that. In terms of that, you called the 70s like the high watermark. That's when Richard Nixon created the EPA.
That's right.
And that it's real clear that from the 70s, that the work that had been done with the New Deal and the Great Society was just hit a wall. And so that's just, make a note for yourself, Ms. Robbins.
Yeah, for sure. Listen, guys, that's all I want to say. I got to quit by 1:30 so I can get across town to a meeting. I look forward to I love chatting. This is fun. And
well, we may have a follow-up, Bob, man. We'll do it at night and drink beer while we do it. How's that?
That'd be great.
Let me just get one quick remark from you, because I have never missed Merle Truesdale more than I do now. And for this project, he would have been such a gift. But he did manage to keep pretty good GROW archives, and he was quite the historian. So we do have that repository of files and data. But I'm just wondering, when you think about Merle Truesdale, he was a complicated cat. And I do want to give him his props in this booklet. And so what do you remember about him? And when you think about Merle, what do you think?
Well, you know, I'm with you now. And thank you, Becci, because you know, I've seen a bunch of Merle's photographs that you have collated and organized and presented, which are just wonderful. And you know, that's a really important way to remember Merle, is archival stuff that he did over the years that just, you know, makes your heart sing when you see those pictures of Merle as a Midlands Tech student, you know, baby-faced kid with a long shoulder-length hair, you know, being student body president, you know, joining with present company to march in the streets of Columbia. It's pretty cool to see, and we miss him terribly. We really do. I'm sitting at a table right now where, you know, Nancy and I've had a bunch of Christmas dinners with Merle Truesdale. You know, we get him over Christmas morning to, you know, eat dinner with us, and so we miss him. We miss him a bunch. You know, Merle is sort of my link to, you know, that his family background in sort of a, you know, rural working class South Carolina. It's always been fascinating to me over the years to listen to Merle tell stories about his father and about growing up, you know, in the larger Columbia community. And gosh, what was the name of it? I can remember when they used the GROW building for a movie set, and they did a Truesdale and something sign on the building. Oh, you know, I don't know what that was, but anyway, you know, it's one of those movies that sort of reminded you of, you know, the country store when the Truesdales would have been at their prime. You know, Merle, he had that, I always used to say, I thought he had a photographic memory. I mean, he had that kind of like memory for details where from who played on a particular cut in a Allman Brothers album, you know, just one of many, he'd remember who did it, right? And he could tell you you know, when such and such happened in the movement. And I think, well, I'm gonna fact check Merle on that one because I don't think that's right. and I would be pretty rare when he didn't get it. I mean, he could bullshit me if he wanted to because I believe it. But the reality is, most everything he did have, you know, somewhere buried in that skull of his, he'd remember a date and a person and what happened when, and take it as gospel, right? Yeah. So anyway, we miss him terribly, and yeah, he was a character and a colleague and a comrade in all those respects, for sure.
Well, Bob, we've realized that the interviews like the one we're doing with you is important beyond this little booklet that we're doing. It's a 50-page booklet. It's not going to fit. I'm going to come back and talk to you about your environmental work.
Well, that's great, man. Thanks. We'll do it. Well, thanks, guys, for doing this, and congratulations. And I'd love to see what the product is. And Becci, I've been really appreciating all of the writing that you've been doing, and you know, efforts at trying to make sure that you know, our history is preserved and we all learn from it. So thanks.
It's your tax dollars at work, Bob. It's Richland County.
Hey.
Richland County tax.
Thank you, guys. Miss you.
Printing this book.
Well, thanks so much, Bob. We really, not just for this, but for all the pro bono work that you've done over the years and for your service to this country. So
likewise, you guys are
it ain't over.
You and Nancy.
It ain't over. That keeps going.
It ain't over. Take care, brother. We'll be in touch.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.